everyone, welcome back. This week we're going to move on and we're going to be looking at chapter 2. So we're going to be talking about how do we count juvenile crimes? Like how do we know exactly what's going on in the world based on numbers of juveniles that are committing crimes. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. And we're going to talk about measurement of juvenile crimes. Okay. So to get started, I want to do a little informal survey. So I want you to think about, did you ever break the law when you were a juvenile? Okay, anything, speeding, running a light, take a piece of candy from a grocery store, anything like that. So on a piece of paper, write down anything that you did that would have broken the law when you were growing up. Underage drinking, underage smoking, anything. So write a list of anything that you did when you were a juvenile that could be considered a crime, okay? Now you're not obviously going to post it on the board, but I want you to write it down. And after you write down all of those things, I want you to cross off any crimes that you were not caught, okay? So write down your whole list and then cross out all the ones that you were not caught, okay? And then start the video when you're done. Okay, so based on this information, what assumptions can you make about juvenile delinquency based on this informal survey? Like, did you cross off a lot of stuff? Did you, well, you may not even have very much, but if you did have some things, were you crossing mostly things off? So what do you think? Do you think most juveniles are actually caught for their delinquent acts? So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. So we want to know really how much juvenile crime really exists out in the world. How much violent crime is committed by juveniles? What sources do we use to gather this information? And that's what we're going to be covering today. So, oh, sorry. Sorry about that. My son was calling me, so I had to ask really quick, or answer really quick. Okay, so let me go back and finish this, or go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, now when we're talking about collecting crime stats, we're going to look at it a little historically first. Now, originally, people weren't even counting juvenile crime. They weren't really worried about it. The first states that even really started to do this were Maine, Massachusetts, and New York. So they were really the first states to think we need to start getting some handle on these numbers. The Department of Justice tried to do it at a federal level in 1870, but everybody was ignoring them. They weren't sending them their numbers. So it was really erratic. It was really unreliable, and nobody really had good numbers on juvenile crime. Now, on other issues that arose with this is that every single state has a different different juvenile system. So the juvenile systems are run by each individual state. So every individual state can have a different system, which makes it difficult to gather data. Also, we talked about reducing the stigma for juveniles. And one of the ways that we tried to reduce the stigma is sealing their records and keeping them confidential. So if records are sealed, it's often hard then to collect crime stats on that information. Also, a lot of juveniles get removed from the system. We try not to put as many through the system. So we divert them into other programs and things like that. So those fall through the cracks. And also there's a lag in data. If you remember when we talked about crime stats in Intro to Criminal Justice, all the numbers are always delayed. So it's not always super accurate. It's usually a year or two behind. Okay. Now, there are some methods that are used for calculating juvenile crime. So there are official government stats, and then there's a couple other forms that are used. So this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the class. Like, what are some of these different formats? So some are collected by law enforcement, by the courts, by corrections, and then we have self-reports, and then we have victimization stats, and we'll talk about each of those. So the official government stats for juveniles is the Uniform Crime Reports. Okay, and then eventually they altered what data they were collecting, and they changed the format of it, and that's the NIBRS. Okay, so the UCR is the Uniform Crime Reports, and the National Incident-Based Reporting System is the system that is used to collect that information. Now, remember, the Uniform Crime Reports is maintained by the FBI. So the FBI is the one that gathers and collects all the data. What they do is they send out surveys to different police agencies, and they ask the agencies to report on how many different crimes occur, okay? And then they gather all that data, and that's what they put together for their information. They calculate the amount of crime based on what they call a crime index. So they take all the numbers of a particular crime. So there's, 100,000 crimes divided by 100,000 population. It gives you a number. That's your crime index. So they measure crime based on that index, okay? So the higher the index, the more of that particular crime that's committed. They also calculate in this process what's called the clearance rate. The clearance rate is how many of these crimes are solved. So they calculate how many crimes are reported to police. Remember, these are reports to police. And then the police have to report when they solve the crime, and that's the clearance rate. So they also calculate how good a department is in clearing crimes. The Uniform Crime Reports also divides crimes into Part 1 and Part 2 offenses. Part 1 are the more serious offenses. Part 2 are the less sort of, a lot of times victimless crime, minor offenses that are the Part 2 offenses. Now, the Part 1 offenses are the main offenses, and they're broken into 2 categories. So you have violent crimes. There's 4 violent crimes that are considered Part 1 offenses. And then you have 4 property crimes that are data is collected on in the Uniform Crime Reports. And both of those, or all 8 of those, are considered Part 1 offenses. So here's a list. Here's the list of the Part 1. So for the violent, we have robbery, rape, murder, and aggravated assault are all considered the violent ones. And then arson, auto theft, burglary, larceny are considered the property offenses, but they're all Part 1 offenses. And then these are the more minor offenses, sometimes victimless crimes, that are counted for Part 2 offenses. Now, what is the information that they're actually collecting in this? Remember, the National Incident based reporting system starts to collect lots of information. So originally the UCR was just counting how many crimes existed, but the National Incident based reporting system wanted a lot more data. So they started to collect a lot of details about the crimes. So age of the offender, race of the offender, the arrest charge, like what are they charging, how many crimes were committed. So one of the factors is age. So once we have age collected with this NIBRS, then we can use that as a juvenile statistic, or a source for juvenile statistics. Okay, so prior to the NIBRS, they didn't really collect information on the age of the offender, but once they incorporated the new NIBRS, then they started to collect that age data, and then they started to learn more and more about juvenile offenses. Okay, so what does the Uniform Crime Reports tell us? Well, it tells us that there is about 630,000 arrests of juveniles every year, roughly around there. The highest amount of arrests are for larceny or theft, about 15%. Simple assault is just right underneath that at 14.7. Drug violations, 11.6. And then property crimes is around 13.4%, lumping them all together. And we know about 33% of individuals arrested for arson are juveniles. So a lot of arson by juveniles. And we know that most of those arson juveniles are under the age of 15. So that's just some of the information we can gather from the Uniform Crime Reports. Now, none of these statistics are perfect. They all have problems. And the first problem is validity. So one of the problems we have is the way that they're collected. So remember, the Uniform Crime Reports is sending reports to police departments, and the police department has to report it back to the federal government. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't report it. Sometimes people don't report crimes to the police in the first place. So then those aren't going to be reported. So sometimes the validity of it may not be as great because people are reporting crimes. We also may have problems with reliability. Different departments may define crimes differently than others. So they may classify certain offenses as a rape where other jurisdictions wouldn't classify that as a rape. And therefore the data may not be as reliable as we would like it to be. Okay, so that's the official government stats from the FBI, from like law enforcement. We also can have some crime statistics that are gathered by the judicial court system. So you have the Office of Judicial Justice and Delinquency Prevention. They collect some data. They collect their information on the number of juveniles that actually appear in juvenile court. So if the case doesn't make it through intake and it's like deferred, then it wouldn't be counted. So it's only people that actually go to court. They stopped doing this one in about 1970s, and then it turned into the National Juvenile Court Data Archives, which started in 1979. So that is the data, that's how they collect the data for court systems. So what are they collecting? They collect information on delinquency, dependency, and status offenses. So not all types of juvenile classifications. They do age, gender, race, reason for the referral, like what is the delinquent act that is being, that they're being referred to for. They recorded data on the adjudication or what ultimately happens to the juvenile, and then disposition, what was the punishment that was given. So these are just some charts that kind of show you different things about it, the number of cases for crimes against persons, crimes against property, drug crimes, public order crimes. So it just shows you kind of some of the statistics on it. One of the things that they learned by this is, so they had numbers of crimes based on the uniform crime reports, but then they had these numbers based on the court system. And it led to the understanding that our juvenile justice system is really, what happens with the criminal justice system and the juvenile system is what we call this funnel effect. So a lot of people are ultimately arrested at first, but during all the steps of the process, different juveniles are sort of siphoned off. And so when you get down to adjudication and actually the disposition, there's very few juveniles that are still in the system. So when you're counting them at the court level, there might be a lot that have already been siphoned out that aren't actually being counted at that time. So what are some things that we've learned through the court statistics? That truancy is mostly the status offense that juveniles are arrested for, but liquor violation is another one. And about 71% of delinquency cases are handled informally and not adjudicated. So that's that siphoning out process. About 71% actually gets filtered out before they actually get to a court proceeding, an adjudication. Okay, so the last group of governmental stats that we have are juvenile correctional stats. So the correctional system also keeps track of juveniles in custody. So this can also be a source for some juvenile statistics. So juveniles that are committed to private or public facilities can be counted. So they're incarcerated, so they've been adjudicated, and their disposition is they have to go to custody. So there's the Children in Custody Survey, the National Survey of Youth in Custody, National Council on Crime and Delinquency. They all kind of give a little bit different information. What do they count? People that are juveniles that are actually in public and private facilities. They get pretty good reporting from the public, but a lot of times the private facilities don't report accurately. So it tells us how many juveniles are actually incarcerated, and it's even less accurate than the court stats because you may have even more juveniles filtered out. They're not actually sent to a correctional type of a juvenile correctional facility. So it's going to count even less. Okay. So all of these governmental stats are problematic. They're not always giving us a good picture of the number of juvenile offenses. Number one, they don't count what we call the dark figures of crime. So if people don't report the crimes to the police, those are crimes that go uncounted. Those are what we call the dark figures of crime. It's not going to count victimless crime. So if kids are using drugs or buy alcohol and aren't counted and not caught, then those aren't ever going to be counted. There is often a hierarchy. We're only really ending up counting the most serious offenses. So it makes it look like all juveniles are committing these horrible, heinous, bad crimes, because those are the ones that are being counted, and they're not necessarily counting the lesser crimes. And all crimes may not be consistent. So different departments may not count them the same way, which would lead to not concise or valid or reliable data. Okay, so if those are the governmental ways to count crime, is there other ways that we can use? And yes, we're going to talk about a last couple, which is what we call self-reporting and victimization stats. Okay, so we can count crime through self-reporting, and then we can count victim reports. So the first one I want to talk about is self-reporting. So these are when juveniles themselves report on their own delinquent acts. So what can happen is there can be surveys at schools or different places where they ask juveniles to fill out a survey anonymously, so that they're not disclosing who they are, they're not going to get arrested for it, and they just ask them to fill out certain questions. Did they commit certain offenses? Okay, so there's the National Youth Survey, and there's Monitoring the Future Survey. Okay, so again, we're just asking juveniles to be truthful and just tell what crimes they have committed. So what do these self-reports tell us? That basically delinquency is much higher than is reported. So we know that the original official numbers from the government under the UCR and the courts and the corrections doesn't count a lot of crimes that are actually being committed. So once we ask juveniles to be honest and they report, then the numbers are much higher for juvenile crime that's committed than what's actually caught. And some of the numbers even show that many may commit as many as 100 crimes before they even get caught for one. Another thing that it shows is, although the crimes, juveniles that are arrested tend to be from the lower classes the most, that's not who's always committing them. So it's really spread out through all demographics who commits crimes. We tend to see the numbers more for the lower class because those are the ones that are targeted and arrested and put in the system. But when you look at these self-reports, you see that it's through all different demographics and socioeconomic status. It is not linked just to lower incomes. And one of the things we can also see is that we can correlate risky behavior to juvenile crime. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the next lecture. We're going to talk about risk factors and things like that. So when you think about self-reporting, like you're letting the juveniles report themselves if they committed crime, what can be some of the strengths and weaknesses of this? Number one, you have to make sure the surveys are all passed out equally. You have to try to assure that they're telling the truth, that's not exaggerated or things aren't left out intentionally. It could be people just have faulty memories. They could be confused on what the questions are asking. They could just lie. So that could be one of the problems with it. But that has proven to be fairly accurate. They found that juveniles that tend to be fairly honest when answering these because there's not really any consequences to them for telling the truth. So think back to when you did that exercise at the very beginning of the lecture and you were crossing out the ones you were not arrested for. And think about it. Would you have self-reported yourself? Would you have gone to the police and reported yourself? Or if you were asked a survey anonymously, would you have filled it out properly and told the truth? So those are things to think about when you think about the accuracy of these crime stats. So the last thing we're going to talk about is victim stats. So to start that out, I want you to think about what is a victim. So we're going to talk about numbers reported by victims. So let's think about what is a victim. Well, a victim is a person who experienced harm, injury, loss, or death, okay? So one of those things, that would be a victim. So most people at some point are a victim of something, okay? So just as another little bit informal survey, I want to ask you, were you ever a victim of a crime when you were juvenile? So write a list of any crimes where you were a victim. Any sort of crime where you punched in the face, where somebody steal your purse, anytime that you were a victim of a crime growing up. Okay. And then off that list, cross off any that you did not report. Okay. So if you did not report them, then cross them out. So then the question is, how many of those are left? And so how accurate are victim stats going to be? Okay. Now, we do, though, count crime through these victimization stats. And what we use for that is the National Crime Victimization Survey. What the National Crime Victimization Survey is it's a survey sent out every year to about 135,000 households, to about 224,000 individuals every year. And then they're collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And basically what they're asking victims to do is report on times when they were victims. Okay, so just like I said, it's the National Crime Victimization Survey maintained by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it's counting victim self-reports. So victims saying that they were victims. Okay. What the purpose of these are is to count the dark figures of crime. So one of the criticisms we said of the Uniform Crime Reports is that it's only counting reports of crimes to police. And what we know based on this National Crime Victimization Survey is there are tons more crimes that occur that are never reported to the police. So the purpose of the NCVS is really to try to get to truer numbers of how many crimes are actually committed. Okay, now their data is slightly different from the Uniform Crime Reports. They collect on some of the similar crimes: robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, rape, but they exclude some things. They exclude murder, kidnapping, arson, and victimless crimes. Murder, because the victim would be dead, and then you could report that you were a victim of murder. And then they just chose not to count kidnapping, arson, or other victimless crimes like drug use and things like that. So they do collect data on some different things. Okay, so what do we know about the National Crime Victimization Survey? What information does this tell us? It tells us that individuals aged 12 through 24 have the highest rate of violent victimization. That means they are victims. So age 12 through 24 has the highest rate of becoming a victim. We know that males, Blacks, and people of lower income levels were more likely to be victimized than females, other races, or higher incomes. So we know that certain groups of people tend to become victims, are more likely to be a victim than other people. So this is not people offending, this is becoming a victim. We know that the crime rate is much higher than it's reported by the Uniform Crime Reports when we ask victims. We know that the Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey end up having very different numbers, but the rankings of crime and which ones are the most severe tend to still fall along the same lines. We know that juveniles are most likely to commit property crimes and a higher rate of being victims of property crimes. We know that a lot of times they're victims of property crimes. And we know that racial minorities tend to be some of the highest victims of crimes. They have a high rate of becoming a victim of a crime. So this is just a chart that shows you some of the stats for juvenile victimization at schools. So violent crimes, and it tells you like what age that they're in. So the different violent crimes, theft, and the numbers that they counted. And then this just shows you some more statistics. So it breaks down age, how many violent crimes there are, and then how many of them are actually reported to police. So that's kind of interesting to look at. So what about the strengths and weaknesses of this? Like what could be some of the problems with this? Well, one of the problems is honesty. People can exaggerate or things like that of being victims. They may not remember. They may not want to answer it at all. So there are some problems with this. There are victims that, you know, are going to be left off even with this survey. And people could answer questions differently based on different definitions in their head. So when we look at all of this information and we kind of compile it all together, so the National Crime, the Uniform Crime Reports and National Incident-Based Reporting System, the victims, the courts, the correctional stats, when we self-reporting, when we look at all of this together, there are some patterns and some things that we can actually see. So the first thing we can see is what we call the age curve. So the age curve is the general idea that you see sort of delinquency spiking at certain ages, and then it slowly starts to decrease as people move out of juvenile, the age, young childhood, okay, or I guess teenage years. So what you see is this increase in delinquency that eventually starts to decrease and reduce down drastically the older people become, and that's the age curve. So that is the word for this lecture. So make sure you stop the video, write the word age curve down, and send me an email. That's your word for this lecture to get your attendance grade. So age curve, okay? So you can kind of see, these are some of the diagrams that show you this age curve based on age and how it does start to come down and fall, okay? Now, when we look at these age curves, we see, you can look at it specifically based on crime. So we know that the property crime curve will spike at an earlier age. So most property crimes are going to spike when they're younger, and then they slowly start to decrease. Violent crimes tend to spike later. Okay, so older juveniles are more likely to commit violent crimes. And female crimes peaks earlier, so more younger juveniles are more likely to commit that, where males peaks later, so more older males. Minorities from high crime disadvantaged neighborhoods, they have a higher and wider curve, so it sustains for a longer period of time. Now, when we look at the stages of delinquency, again, all these numbers from all these crime stats, we can sort of also find some other things. So the age of onset. So the age of onset is the first age that juveniles actually start to commit crime. So what is that age of onset? What's the age juveniles will start to commit crime? And we know that juveniles who begin at an earlier age are more likely to keep offending throughout all their juvenile years and even into adulthood. So if you have an earlier age of onset, you're going to have continued delinquency for a much longer period of time. We also know that the age of onset can vary based on the crimes that you're talking about. So gang activity, it's usually around 15. Marijuana is usually around 16. Gun carrying is usually around 17. Remember, we said property crimes is a little younger. So we know that we can determine age of onset based on particular crimes. Persistence is how long that delinquency continues, right? So you commit one crime, do you keep escalating and persisting and continuing to commit delinquent acts, or is it like a one-time thing? Okay, so that's persistence. And then desistance is when you quit becoming delinquent. So if you do commit a delinquent act, when do you stop committing delinquent acts? And we can kind of look at some data about when that occurs. If juveniles do persist into adulthood, we know that their behavior becomes more violent and the crimes become more serious. But a lot of times we know that it desists as the juvenile reaches their 20s and older. It starts to come down. Okay, so those are just some terms to understand about delinquent behavior. Oh, I guess I told you all before. So age of onset, this is just a slide when they start to commit. And then persistence, here's your definition of persistence. My mouth was faster than my finger. and then desistance. Okay, so those are some of your definitions. So what do we know from all this information? Almost all juveniles break the law at least some point in their life. All of you probably wrote down one thing that you did, which would have broken the law when you were juvenile. I know I did. But most are not serious. A lot of them never get reported, either to the police or by victims or anything. Most are more minor offenses, property types of offenses, but we know that there are some juveniles that persist and that they become more habitual offenders. And generally, if they do, their offenses become more and more serious. Okay. Another thing we know that there tends to be a sharp rise in juvenile crime in the 1980s and early 90s, but then there was a decrease. Now, right now, we're having an overall rise in crime. So those statistics may be changing in current years because the overall crime rate is starting to rise again. Okay, so what you would need to do based on this lecture is Chapter 2 discussion. So what do you think? You've been asked by Batavia School District to analyze how much crime exists. So they're asking you your advice. Which method do you think would be best to calculate crime in the Batavia School District? So look back at all the different methods and then decide how would you do it? Which methods would you use to properly count the crime that exists in the district? Okay, so that's it for the first one. What we're going to do for the next lecture is we're going to talk about risk assessment. So we're going to look at what are some of the factors that are more likely to cause a juvenile to become delinquent, and then what are some of the factors that protect them from becoming delinquent. And that's what we'll do to finish up this week. Okay, so I will see you soon, and hopefully you enjoyed that.